A man sits alone in a small room at Fort Meade, Maryland, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and measured. The year is 1980, and outside this sterile chamber the Cold War grinds forward, with satellites and supercomputers and missile silos buried deep in the American plains. Inside, the man is attempting something that should not be possible. He is trying to see through walls, across continents, into the locked rooms of Soviet military installations, using nothing but his mind. A technician watches through reinforced glass, noting the time, the subject's heart rate, the ambient temperature. On a desk sits a sealed envelope containing coordinates, a location thousands of miles away that the subject has never visited and cannot know. Yet in 14 minutes, he will describe a building, a courtyard, a submarine pen on the Kamchatka Peninsula with enough accuracy to make 3 intelligence analysts go silent when they compare his sketch to reconnaissance photographs. This is not science fiction. This is not fantasy. This is Project Stargate, a $20 million attempt by the United States intelligence community to turn human consciousness into a weapon, and every word of what follows is drawn from declassified files and public archives. The program had many names before it became Stargate. In the beginning, in 1978, it was called Gondola Wish, then Grill Flame, then Center Lane, then Sunstreak, each redesignation an attempt to bury the paper trail or refresh security clearances, or simply to confuse the oversight committees who might ask uncomfortable questions. The core mission never changed: to determine whether extrasensory perception, remote viewing, psychokinesis, and other phenomena dismissed by mainstream science could provide actionable intelligence in an era when America's adversaries were exploring the same forbidden territories. The Soviet Union had been researching psychic warfare for decades, or so the reports claimed, funding laboratories in Leningrad and Moscow where telepaths attempted to influence submarine crews, and remote viewers tried to pierce the veil of classified American facilities. The fear was not that psychic powers were real, but that, if they were real and the Soviets mastered them first, the balance of terror that kept the peace would shatter. So the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, with quiet support from the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, and the Army's Intelligence and Security Command, authorized a program that would test the limits of human perception and, in doing so, test the limits of what the intelligence community was willing to believe. The man who made it possible was a physicist named Harold Puthoff, a former naval officer who had worked at the National Security Agency, NSA, and later at Stanford Research Institute, a prestigious think tank in Menlo Park, California. Puthoff was not a mystic. He held a doctorate from Stanford, had published papers on quantum mechanics and laser physics, and moved in circles where skepticism was a professional requirement. But in the early 1970s, he had become interested in the claims of Uri Geller, an Israeli entertainer who said he could bend spoons with his mind, read thoughts sealed in envelopes, and describe distant locations he had never seen. Puthoff and his colleague Russell Targ invited Geller to Stanford Research Institute in 1972 and conducted a series of experiments that, according to their published results, produced anomalous data. Geller drew a picture of a bridge that matched a randomly selected target site. He reproduced the face of a die sealed inside a metal box. He described the interior of a building at coordinates he could not have known. The scientific community reacted with contempt. Critics pointed out methodological flaws, the possibility of sensory leakage, the long history of stage magicians fooling even careful observers. But Puthoff and Targ were convinced, and more importantly, so were a handful of officials Inside, the intelligence agencies who read their reports and saw not a parlor trick, but a potential asset. If remote viewing worked even a fraction of the time, it could supplement satellite reconnaissance, confirm or deny human intelligence, and locate hostages or weapons in places where no spy satellite could see. The program began modestly. Puthoff and Targ received funding from the CIA to study a small group of subjects, civilians and military personnel who claimed to have psychic abilities or who scored well on preliminary tests. The method they developed was called coordinate remote viewing, and it worked like this. A subject would be given only the geographic coordinates of a target, latitude and longitude, nothing more. They would then enter a light meditative state, describe the images and impressions that came to them, and sketch what they saw. A monitor, usually a trained psychologist or intelligence officer, would guide the session, asking neutral questions but providing no feedback that might contaminate the data. The transcripts and drawings would be sealed, compared against known intelligence, and scored for accuracy. Early results were mixed but intriguing. Some sessions produced nothing but vague impressions and meaningless shapes. Others yielded descriptions that matched satellite photographs with unsettling precision. In one experiment conducted in 1974, a remote viewer described a large crane, a gantry structure, and a spherical object at a site in the Soviet Union that analysts later identified as a nuclear test facility at Semipalatinsk. The viewer had never been briefed on the location, had no access to reconnaissance imagery, and yet his sketch looked like a declassified NSA photo. The DIA took notice. By 1978, the program had moved from the civilian labs at Stanford Research Institute to a secure military facility at Fort Meade, Maryland, home of the NSA, and a sprawling complex of windowless buildings where signals intelligence officers decoded Soviet communications and planned electronic warfare operations. The remote viewing unit was small, fewer than 20 personnel at its peak, tucked into an unremarkable office space with beige walls and fluorescent lights and filing cabinets that held some of the strangest intelligence reports ever written by the United States government. The soldiers assigned to the unit were volunteers, screened for psychological stability and what the program called high signal to noise ratio in their psychic impressions. They came from military intelligence backgrounds, trained in map reading and threat analysis, and they understood the stakes. They were not New Age mystics or spiritual seekers. They were professional intelligence operators being asked to perform an impossible task, and the pressure to produce results was constant. The most famous remote viewer was a man named Joseph McMoneagle, a chief warrant officer in the Army who had served in Vietnam and survived a near-death experience that he believed had opened his mind to extrasensory perception. McMoneagle joined the program in 1978, and over the next decade participated in hundreds of sessions targeting Soviet military facilities, terrorist safe houses, hostages held in Lebanon, and even a downed Soviet bomber in Africa. His handlers gave him coordinates, sometimes just a random number sequence that had been assigned to a target, known only to the tasking officer. And McMoneagle would sit in a darkened room, breathe deeply, and let the impressions come. He described it as watching a movie projected onto the back of his eyelids, images that arrived in fragments, angles and textures and emotional tones that had to be assembled like a jigsaw puzzle. In one session in 1979, he was asked to remote view a building at a location he was not told. He drew a large submarine, a covered dry dock, and a peculiar, flat structure that looked like a launching ramp. Weeks later, satellite reconnaissance confirmed the existence of a new class of Soviet ballistic missile submarine under construction at Severodvinsk, and McMoneagle's sketch was filed as corroborating intelligence. The program operated in near-total secrecy for more than a decade, its existence known only to a small circle of Pentagon officials and intelligence analysts who used its reports to supplement conventional collection methods. The remote viewers targeted Soviet missile silos, trying to determine which ones were operational and which were decoys. They attempted to locate American hostages held by Hezbollah in Lebanon, describing rooms, buildings, and street layouts that were later compared to debriefings after the hostages were released. They searched for Colonel Muammar Gaddafi during the American airstrikes on Libya in 1986, though whether their visions helped the bombers find their targets remains classified. They even worked on domestic cases, assisting in the search for kidnapping victims and fugitives, though this raised uncomfortable legal questions about whether military psychics should be used against American citizens. The accuracy rate, according to internal assessments, ranged from 15 to 30%, far above random chance, but far below the threshold needed to justify operational reliance. The problem was not that remote viewing never worked, but that it worked unpredictably, sometimes producing brilliant hits and other times producing noise that wasted analyst time and diverted resources. The tradecraft evolved as the program matured. Early sessions were informal, almost conversational, with the monitor and the viewer discussing impressions in real time. By the mid-1980s, the protocol had become rigorous and standardized. A session began with the viewer in a quiet room, sitting at a blank desk with only paper and pencil. The monitor would read the coordinates or the target designation, nothing more. The viewer would close their eyes, center their breathing, and begin to verbalize whatever came to mind. The monitor would record everything, asking clarifying questions, but never confirming or denying the accuracy of the impressions. The session would last 30 to 60 minutes, sometimes longer if the data seemed promising. Afterward, the viewer would produce a written summary and a series of sketches which would be submitted to the intelligence analysts who had tasked the session. The analysts would compare the remote viewing data to satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human source reporting, scoring the session on a scale that measured both accuracy and utility. A perfect score was rare. Most sessions produced a mix of correct and incorrect details, vague impressions that could not be verified, and occasional flashes of specificity that defied easy explanation. The technology used was minimal because the entire premise of remote viewing was that the human mind could access information without the mediation of machines. There were no electrodes, no brain scanners, no drugs to enhance perception. The only tools were paper, pencil, and the disciplined focus of the viewer. Some researchers experimented with sensory deprivation tanks, electromagnetic shielding, and audio tones designed to induce theta brain wave states, but the results were inconclusive. The most effective technique, it seemed, was simply to select viewers with natural ability and train them to quiet the mental noise that obscured the signal. Puthoff and Targ developed a series of exercises modeled on meditation and self-hypnosis, teaching viewers to distinguish between imagination and genuine perception, though the line between the two was always blurry. The psychological toll on the viewers was significant. Many reported vivid nightmares, intrusive thoughts, and a sense of disorientation that came from spending hours each day in a dissociative state. Some believed they were genuinely perceiving distant locations through some unknown mechanism of consciousness. Others suspected they were simply guessing well, pattern, matching from fragments of prior knowledge, or picking up subtle cues from their monitors. The program did not demand faith, only performance. The most controversial aspect of Project Stargate was its relationship to the broader world of paranormal research, a field littered with frauds, charlatans, and true believers who saw what they wanted to see. The intelligence community understood this danger. They brought in professional magicians, including James Randi, a skeptic famous for debunking psychics, to observe sessions and identify potential trickery. They designed protocols to eliminate sensory leakage, ensuring that the viewer could not hear, see, or otherwise access normal information about the target. They rotated monitors and viewers to prevent collusion, and they kept the tasking process isolated from the analysis process so that no one could massage the data to produce favorable results. Despite these precautions, the scientific validity of the program remained in dispute. Mainstream psychologists and physicists dismissed remote viewing as pseudoscience, a waste of taxpayer money, and an embarrassment to serious intelligence work. Supporters pointed to the handful of unexplained successes, the sessions where viewers described details that should have been impossible to know, and argued that even if the mechanism was unknown, the phenomenon was real enough to warrant study. In 1984, the program received one of its highest profile taskings. The CIA wanted to know more about a suspected Soviet radar installation at a location in Siberia that satellites had imaged but not fully analyzed. The remote viewer assigned to the task, a woman whose identity remains classified, described a large parabolic antenna, underground bunkers, and what she called a humming or vibrating sensation that she associated with high-powered electronics. Her sketch included details about the layout of the facility, the placement of guard towers, and even the color of the buildings, which she said were pale green. When the intelligence analysts compared her report to subsequent satellite passes and signals intercepts, they found that the facility was indeed a phased array radar used for ballistic missile detection, and several of the details she described, including the color of the structures and the underground component, matched the classified assessments. The success was not total. She had missed some elements and added others that could not be verified. But it was enough to keep the program funded for another year. The program's most ambitious operation, and perhaps its most tragic, came in 1987 when it was tasked with locating William Buckley, the CIA station chief in Beirut, who had been kidnapped by Hezbollah in 1984. Buckley was a high-value target, his capture a humiliation for the agency, and his interrogation under torture a security nightmare because he knew the identities of agents across the Middle East. The remote viewers were asked to find him, to describe the building where he was held, the faces of his captors, and any clues that might lead to a rescue. Multiple sessions were conducted over several months. The viewers described stone buildings, narrow streets, a basement room, the smell of mildew and decay. One viewer sketched a building with a distinctive archway and a courtyard, details that were passed to the CIA's Beirut task force. But the intelligence was never actionable. Buckley died in captivity in June 1985, likely from torture and medical neglect, and his body was not recovered until 1991. The remote viewing reports were filed away, their accuracy impossible to verify, and the failure haunted the program's operators who had desperately wanted to save him. The economics of Project Stargate were modest by Pentagon standards, but extraordinary for a program that produced no hardware, no weapons, no visible infrastructure. Over its 17-year existence, The program cost approximately $20 million, split among personnel salaries, facility overhead, and research contracts with Stanford Research Institute, and later with Science Applications International Corporation, a defense contractor that took over the research in the 1990s. The cost per session was negligible, a few $100s for the viewer's time and the monitor's supervision. But the opportunity cost was harder to calculate. Every hour spent on remote viewing was an hour not spent on signals intelligence, human source development, or satellite reconnaissance, and critics within the intelligence community argued that the program diverted resources from proven methods to chase a fantasy. Supporters countered that the cost was trivial compared to the billions spent on Cold War defense systems, and that even a slim chance of success justified the investment. The program's survival depended on the patronage of a few believers in senior positions, officers who had seen the unexplained successes and believed that remote viewing, however imperfect, was worth exploring. The political cover for the program came from its deep classification and its bureaucratic obscurity. It was funded through black budget channels, hidden in line items that congressional overseers rarely scrutinized, and justified as basic research into human performance optimization, a phrase vague enough to encompass everything from sleep deprivation studies to psychic espionage. The few members of Congress who were briefed on the program reacted with skepticism, but none moved to shut it down because the cost was low and the potential embarrassment of a public leak was high. The intelligence agencies did not want the world to know that the United States was spending money on psychics, not because it would reveal a vulnerability, but because it would make them look foolish. The Soviets, by contrast, were rumored to be investing far more in psychotronic weapons and telepathic communication, programs that may have been real or may have been disinformation designed to spook the Americans into wasting resources. The truth was impossible to determine because both sides lied about everything, and the Cold War was as much a contest of paranoia as it was a contest of weapons. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and with it the rationale for many Cold War programs, including Project Stargate. The Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, and within 2 years the Soviet state had dissolved into 15 independent republics, none of them capable of mounting the kind of existential threat that had justified decades of covert operations. The intelligence community began a painful restructuring, cutting budgets, closing facilities, and terminating programs that no longer served the post-Cold War mission. Project Stargate was vulnerable because it had never produced the kind of breakthrough success that would have made it indispensable. It had contributed to operations, corroborated intelligence, and occasionally surprised analysts with unexplained hits, but it had not found a hostage, prevented a terrorist attack, or located a weapons cache in a way that could be definitively attributed to remote viewing. The program had become a curiosity, a relic of an era when the intelligence community was willing to try almost anything to gain an edge over the Soviets. The turning point came in 1995 when the CIA commissioned an external review of the program, contracting with the American Institutes for Research, a non-profit organization, to assess whether remote viewing was scientifically valid and operationally useful. The review was led by 2 psychologists, Ray Heyman, a skeptic, and Jessica Utz, a statistician who believed the data showed genuine anomalies. Their conclusions were split. Utz argued that the statistical evidence for remote viewing was robust, that the effect size was small but real, and that the phenomenon deserved further study. Hyman countered that the methodology was flawed, that the hits could be explained by chance, vague language, and the subjective nature of the scoring process, and that no mechanism existed to explain how remote viewing could work within the known laws of physics. The final report, delivered in September 1995, concluded that remote viewing had not been shown to provide reliable intelligence and recommended that the program be terminated. The CIA accepted the recommendation, and Project Stargate was officially shut down on November 29, 1995. Its files declassified in stages over the next decade. The aftermath was a mix of vindication and disappointment. The remote viewers themselves were reassigned to conventional intelligence duties or retired from the military, their years of psychic service a footnote in their personnel files. Some, like Joseph McMoneagle, went public with their stories, publishing memoirs and appearing on television programs to describe their experiences. McMoneagle's book, Mind Trek, became a minor bestseller in the paranormal literature community, and he spent the rest of his life giving lectures and consulting on remote viewing techniques. Others remained silent, bound by non-disclosure agreements, or simply unwilling to become the public face of a program that many considered a joke. Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ continued their research into consciousness and quantum mechanics, arguing that the negative conclusion of the American Institutes for Research Review was premature and that the program had been shut down just as it was beginning to produce actionable intelligence. Critics in the scientific community dismissed these claims as wishful thinking, the last gasp of a failed experiment. The declassified files revealed a program that was simultaneously rigorous and absurd, a collision between cold empiricism and human desperation. The transcripts of remote viewing sessions read like dream journals, filled with fragmentary images and emotional tones that had to be interpreted by intelligence analysts trained to extract meaning from noise. A viewer might describe a feeling of cold, a sense of metal, a color that felt like danger, and the analysts would compare this to known facilities and try to find a match. Sometimes the match was uncanny. Other times it was a stretch, the kind of after-the-fact reasoning that made skeptics roll their eyes. The program's supporters pointed to the hits and argued that even a 15% success rate was valuable when dealing with targets that were otherwise inaccessible. The detractors pointed to the misses and argued that 15% was indistinguishable from lucky guessing, especially when the scoring criteria were subjective and the analysts knew what they were looking for. The cultural impact of Project Stargate was disproportionate to its operational significance. The program became a touchstone for conspiracy theorists who believed the government was hiding the truth about psychic powers, UFOs, and other phenomena that challenged the materialist worldview. Books, documentaries, and movies used Stargate as inspiration, blending fact and fiction until it became impossible to separate the two. The film, The Men Who Stare at Goats, a comedic take on psychic warfare, was loosely based on the program, though it exaggerated the absurdity and downplayed the seriousness with which the participants approached their work. The broader public learned that the CIA and the DIA had spent millions of dollars trying to turn soldiers into psychics, and the reaction ranged from amusement to outrage to a kind of fascinated disbelief. The program became shorthand for government waste, for the paranoia of the Cold War, and for the lengths to which desperate people will go when faced with an adversary they cannot understand. The lessons of Project Stargate are harder to parse. On one level, it is a cautionary tale about the dangers of wishful thinking, of allowing belief to outpace evidence, and of funding programs based on hope rather than results. The intelligence community spent 2 decades and $20 million chasing a phenomenon that mainstream science says does not exist, and in the end, they had little to show for it beyond a filing cabinet full of strange reports and a handful of unexplained anecdotes. On another level, it is a story about the limits of human knowledge, the willingness to explore the unknown even when the odds are against you, and the recognition that if psychic espionage were possible, even in a limited way, the side that mastered it first would have an incalculable advantage. The program was born from fear, sustained by curiosity, and killed by budget cuts and scientific skepticism, but it represented something more than just a failed experiment. It represented a moment when the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world admitted, however quietly, that there were things it did not understand and could not control. The archives at the CIA's library in Langley, Virginia, and the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, now hold thousands of pages of declassified Project Stargate documents available to researchers and journalists who want to understand what the government was thinking when it decided to weaponize consciousness. The files include session transcripts, analytical reports, budget justifications, and internal memos debating the program's value. They also include the drawings, those haunting sketches made by viewers who claim to see across continents and through walls, images of buildings and landscapes and machines rendered in pencil by people who should not have known what they were drawing. Some of the sketches are eerily accurate. Others are abstract and useless. All of them are reminders that for 17 years, in a small office at Fort Meade, a handful of soldiers sat in silence and tried to see the world with their minds, and no one can say with absolute certainty whether they succeeded or simply wanted to believe they did. The program's termination did not end the debate. In the years since 1995, new research into consciousness, quantum entanglement, and the nature of perception has reopened questions that Project Stargate tried to answer. Some physicists have speculated that information could be transferred through non-local means, that the mind might interact with distant systems in ways that do not violate causality, but do violate our intuitions about how the universe works. Others have dismissed these ideas as pseudoscience, a misapplication of quantum mechanics to justify paranormal beliefs. The remote viewers themselves remain divided. Some believe they genuinely accessed information through extrasensory means, that the mind is capable of feats we do not yet understand. Others believe they were good guessers, pattern recognizers, or simply people who wanted so badly to help their country that they convinced themselves they were seeing the impossible. Project Stargate was a gamble, an intelligence operation built on the thinnest of premises and sustained by the occasional flash of success that kept the believers believing. It was a product of its time, an era when the Cold War made anything seem possible, when the fear of Soviet psychic superiority was real enough to justify spending millions on a program that defied scientific explanation. It was also a human story, the story of soldiers and scientists who sat in dark rooms and tried to push the boundaries of perception, who endured mockery and doubt and the gnawing suspicion that they were wasting their time, and who kept going because the stakes were too high to give up. In the end, the program failed not because remote viewing was definitively disproven, but because it could not be proven. And in the hard world of intelligence collection, unproven methods do not survive. The conclusion we are left with is uncomfortable. If remote viewing works, even occasionally, then consciousness is stranger than we imagine, and the universe contains channels of information that our instruments cannot detect. If remote viewing does not work, then Project Stargate was a $20 million exercise in self-deception, a reminder that even smart people can believe in things that are not true when the pressure is high and the need is great. The declassified files offer no final answer, only data points and anecdotes, and the testimony of people who were there. The program existed, it tried, and it ended, and what it left behind is a question that cannot be resolved: whether the human mind can reach across space and time to touch the hidden things, or whether the viewers were simply seeing what they hoped to see, painting pictures in the dark and calling it intelligence. The answer, like so much in the world of espionage, remains classified in the deeper sense, locked not in a vault, but in the limits of what we can know.